Welcome everybody to the January Animal Care Wednesday webinar. I'm Heidi Carroll with SDSU Extension up in Brookings, South Dakota. The Animal Care Wednesday webinars are a multi-state collaboration between Extension and 4-H personnel in South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri. Today's topic is going to be selected animal diseases and reminders for producers and youth, and we're going to have Dr. Dustin Oedekoven, our state veterinarian in South Dakota, kind of give a brief update on a few of the animal care challenges that we see in terms of diseases. If you have any questions, feel free to type them at any time in the chat box function of Zoom. If you have any issues with your audio, please use the chat box function to communicate those. We will keep everybody muted throughout the recording, and we'll address the questions at the end. Without adding any other issues, we should have a nice quality recording to be posted at a later date. I put the web link there in the chat box for you, so if you do want to go back at a later time or see the handouts from today's presentation, they will also be available at the website link probably within a week of today's webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Oedekoven to begin today's Animal Care Wednesday webinar.
Okay, thank you, Heidi. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're coming through good.
Okay, great. Thanks for asking, thanks for having me on the webinar this morning, and I appreciate everybody taking a little time to tune in to this webinar today. The topic that Heidi asked me to talk about was animal diseases and some reminders for 4-H youth, and I've changed the title a couple of times. We're going to cover a lot of different topics here in a short amount of time. So I'll get started here quickly, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. And as I understand it, Heidi will post this presentation too. So if I'm going too fast, don't worry, there'll be an opportunity to get some of this information later. So, so I've just picked a few diseases. It's really difficult to cover a comprehensive list of diseases that you might be concerned about with regard to youth livestock exhibition events, and that's kind of how I've focused this presentation. But I've taken each species and put diseases of concern for exhibition projects, or at least those that we might either be concerned about, or some that we deal with at the fair time, or in the course of working with youth who are involved in livestock projects. So for cattle, whether it be beef cattle or dairy cattle, some of the concerns that we have as far as exhibition cattle would be bovine respiratory disease, or any of the respiratory diseases really that can be a lot of times viral in nature. But and I'll skip back and forth a little bit with some information I'll get to later in the presentation. But one of the things we think about is, or at least that I think about is, when we have all these fairs and exhibitions going on, anytime you commingle animals, livestock, there's a chance that they'll spread these pathogens, viruses or bacteria, whatever the cause may be of the disease. And so frequent movement and the stress of travel and new places and new water and being on the road can sometimes cause these diseases to take effect in these animals. They may be carrying these pathogens, and that's oftentimes the case with these respiratory diseases, where they're actually carrying some of those pathogens routinely, but the stress of movement, commingling, travel, that sort of thing can actually bring on the disease. So it's important to be watching for signs of respiratory disease, labored breathing, discharge from the nose, that sort of thing. And when we see animals with those signs, first of all, if we see them before the event, it's best not to take them to the event. And then if during the event, that's where we want to move them to a quarantine pen or some other, isolated area. So digestive diseases, a number of which can be viral, caused by viruses, are in that same category. So I put warts on here not because it's a major issue, although warts can be transmitted from cattle to other species, and it is something that we see, especially at the state fair in South Dakota. Sometimes we see animals with warts coming to the fair, and we have taken the approach for many years that the state fair especially is where people bring their best and without blemish if possible. And so the warts are something that we will reject animals for coming to the fair. And I'm aware that several county fairs do that as well. So um, ringworm in that same category. Also, ringworm is transmissible to people, and so if we see that, we usually reject those animals. I put rabies on here because rabies is a zoonotic disease. Zoonotic diseases being those that can be transmitted between um, humans and animals. And cattle do get rabies. We see cases of that in South Dakota almost annually. And so I generally suggest that when you have a project animal, the one that's in close contact with people, especially youth, it may be a good idea to vaccinate those animals for rabies, and that vaccine can be purchased from a local veterinarian. So in the other, and that's not an exhaustive list, of course, but in the other column are some other things that I put down, just things that you might want to be aware of when working with youth with livestock projects. Of course, reproductive, respiratory, and enteric diseases are always on the list. Johne's disease is something that's out there, and there's a lot more information on that on our website, as well as many others. Trichomoniasis is one that's in the news a lot, or that we think about, especially here in South Dakota. I don't know, maybe Iowa or Minnesota, if we've got any folks on the call there, may not be as concerned about it. I think Iowa has an import test requirement, but this would be more for movement of bulls. And we do have an open cow restriction in South Dakota. So, and I had to put bovine tuberculosis on there. It's really, we're 101 years now into an eradication program for bovine TB. It really doesn't occur very often, but we did have 2 outbreaks in South Dakota last year. So I'll mention that. And I can see I'm going to have to go much faster to get through these slides here. So I'll go quickly, and we can come back and talk about these. But here on the swine slide, swine influenza virus has been a concern at exhibitions. Ohio, Michigan over in the past year have both had a number of cases of swine influenza, in some cases that ended up causing influenza in humans. So one of the factors there is the time that the pigs are at the fair, and most of our South Dakota fairs are of short enough length that we don't see swine influenza as a problem at the fair, but certainly we do see diagnoses of swine influenza virus in South Dakota. PED virus was a newly emerging disease in 2013 and gave us all a reminder of new and emerging diseases and how we react to those. And some of you may recall that we had new guidance that year for Project Swine and how they were being identified and weighed beforehand. And I think that changed some of the things that we were doing for the better from a biosecurity standpoint. All of these diseases for pigs, I mean, pigs are one of the areas where biosecurity really is revealed. And pigs spread these viral diseases, all of them listed there on the left are viral diseases, except for the last one, erysipelas. And they spread them very, very efficiently. So those are some to be aware of. Erysipelas, I put that on there just because we did have a pig at the state fair a few years ago that had that while it was at the fair, came in healthy on a health certificate, and still showed up with erysipelas a few days into the fair. So on the right side there, Seneca virus A is in the news, and it's a foot and mouth disease look-alike virus. It's been causing us a lot of concern at the slaughter plants. Pseudorabies virus and swine brucellosis are, at this point in our part of the country, basically historical diseases, although they both still exist in feral swine in the southeast part of the country, so they're more of a concern that way. But I can recall showing pigs when I was younger, and we had to have pseudorabies virus test before they could go to the county fair because we still had PRV in South Dakota. Sheep, I put scrapie at the bottom there on exhibition, kind of because that's, scrapie's almost been eradicated from the United States. We're getting pretty close, but most people will be familiar with those scrapie tags, which are still a requirement in most cases for exhibiting sheep and moving sheep across state lines. Ringworm is one of the big things we see in sheep at exhibitions, and it's a fungal disease that really, especially in sheep that are washed, and lose their lanolin, protective lanolin covering to their skin. Sometimes they can be more susceptible to ringworm, and of course that can transfer to people, and we do reject those from the exhibitions as well. So, but obviously for sheep, respiratory disease is a big issue. Ovine progressive pneumonia is one of those. I put ram epididymitis on there. That's Brucella ovis. Not a big concern actually, but it is a regulated disease, and oftentimes rams that are being sold across state lines will need to have a negative test for ram epididymitis. Some other issues over there on the right you can study up on later. For goats, again, respiratory diseases, and I put scrapie on there again. Scrapie is actually very rare in goats, and again, we're just on the tail end of that eradication program, but nonetheless, it's an important thing to keep in mind, partly because of the regulatory nature and the requirement for the tags, and a number of diseases on the right to be thinking about. Okay, horses. And horses are moving all over the place to ropings and barrel racing and shows and all kinds of things. And if you're interested, search on the Equine Disease Communication Center. That's the EDCC. If you'd like to get frequent updates on all of these diseases and more, you can find out which shows and where they're popping up all over the place. Bottom line, though, it's a reminder why we do routine health care and health inspections for horses that are moving a lot, as they certainly are susceptible to a number of viral, almost all these are viral diseases except for strangles, pigeon fever, and just those two. Rabies, there again, I put that on here because no reason why we shouldn't be vaccinating horses for rabies, especially those that are moving a lot. It's a fairly inexpensive and very effective vaccine. So poultry, and there are all kinds of things we could talk about on poultry, but one of the main things for exhibition poultry is Salmonella pylori. Again, a federally regulated disease, so that's why we end up talking about it. Not that it's really an ongoing concern, but most poultry that are moving, all poultry moving across state lines will either need to be from a pylori-free source or have been tested for pylori. Avian influenza, I think probably everybody's aware of, recall the outbreaks that we had in 2015 and the importance of monitoring for respiratory and neurologic diseases that could be avian influenza. We could talk all day about whether backyard poultry are at higher risk or not. I think what we saw in 2015 and went against what we had historically thought were, that backyard poultry may be at higher risk for avian influenza, but really where we saw it was in the commercial poultry. So again, there's the whole day's discussion on that, but parasites and mycoplasmosis are other diseases that can be spread at the show or while poultry are confined in exhibition quarters. So on the right side there, I put nutrition and sanitation because those are really some of the biggest challenges that youth project exhibitors deal with, especially if they're not familiar with poultry rearing. Those are some key skills to learn and to understand. Those are important in disease prevention in any species, but really poultry seem to be, it's, I guess it's important in poultry. I'll say that. Moving on to rabbits, and there's all kinds of things we could investigate in rabbits, but Pasteurella is a bacterial disease that goes by the name of snuffles, and if you've been in a rabbit show at any time, you can usually find some rabbits in there that have what they call snuffles, which is really rhinitis or it's an upper respiratory disease, but it can lead to more serious concerns such as pneumonia, neurological disease called Rhineck, and multiple abscesses throughout the body. So, and that is a very easily spread bacteria. Again, sanitation comes into play there, both at the rabbit quarters at home and then at the exhibition event. So sanitation is key here as well. Some other diseases listed on the right there that you might encounter as someone getting into a rabbit project might encounter some of those issues, especially the parasitic infections. But again, sanitation, nutrition, and husbandry will help solve a lot of those concerns. Okay, so I'm going to go along here. I see I'm up against the time, and Heidi, you'll just have to let me know if you need to get the gong out, but I'll try to buzz through these. So um, livestock exhibitions have long been a showcase of 4-H and youth livestock projects, and they can serve to teach many of life's lessons, but obviously proper care and husbandry of livestock should be the focus here. And it's also a great opportunity for youth livestock leaders and parents to teach the youth animal exhibitors about biosecurity, animal health regulations, and livestock industry concerns. Because after all, you know, the show is a show, but you know, hopefully what we're teaching here to our youth is about animal production and some of the things that they'll encounter in the livestock industry and the ag industry as they go forward. Not all of them will stay with animal agriculture or livestock production, but at least gives them an awareness of some of the considerations when, you know, in the production system. So the following slides that I'm going to go over here are specific to South Dakota. If we've got other folks on the phone from other states, I would certainly encourage you to check with your state animal health official to learn about guidance or regulations, governing animal exhibitions in your state. So two slides here that really go over the basic parts of a rule in South Dakota that's under the Animal Industry Board. First part, and these have been in place for a long time, but all public exhibitions in the state are technically under the supervision of the Animal Industry Board. We don't have staff at all of those exhibitions, obviously, but we do delegate that to a licensed veterinarian. And the veterinarian is, you know, of the choice of the management of the exhibition. So the veterinarian's job then is to administer a visual inspection of all animals and administer the rules of the Animal Industry Board. So those will typically be around sanitation, as well as reportable diseases and some of the regulated diseases such as Salmonella pylori that I mentioned before, and historically pseudorabies in swine, and now, you know, more likely we're to look at swine influenza virus and things of those nature. So the facilities must be cleaned and disinfected under the supervision of a veterinarian before the animals are placed into the facilities. Again, hopefully you can see by some of the lists of diseases why that's important. You have to have a quarantine division established by the management, and it really doesn't have to be anything fancy, but it should be some quarters away from the rest of the animals, so that if you find an animal that is exhibiting signs of contagious infectious disease, that they can be moved away from the rest of the livestock to an area where they're not going to be of concern to the rest of the livestock until they can, you know, either be sent to a veterinary clinic or back home or away from the rest of the animals. And then all animals exhibiting symptoms of communicable disease as determined by the veterinarian must be quarantined or removed from the premises only under the direction of the veterinarian. And the last point there is that certificates of veterinary inspection are required, and that goes for animals moving within the state or coming from other states. So that's just a quick overview. That's two sections of that regulation. Again, other states may have similar regulations, and we see those, you know, we're pretty flexible in how, you know, the intent of the regulations are met. You know, we have lots of questions, and I'm sure we can get into this later too, but does the veterinarian have to be there during the whole show? Not necessarily, and it kind of depends on the size of the show, and there's a lot of factors to consider there, but, you know, the basic tenets are sanitation, health certificates, and having a veterinarian who you can call upon to follow up on any concerns that may present at the fair or the show. Okay, so lots of other resources for you to look at later. One, California's done a nice job putting together a biosecurity toolkit for equine events. They have some very large equine events out there, and they figured out how to do some practical things there to help people out. The National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians has a compendium on animals in public settings. And I think it's recently been revised with the help of Dr. Russ Daly, and certainly offers a lot of information for folks involved in youth livestock events, or really animals in public settings of any kind to try and help minimize the spread of zoonotic diseases. The National Pork Board has a great toolkit that came out after PED virus showed up. It's called the Champion's Guide to Youth Swine Exhibition, and I highly recommend you check that out. Here's some other resources, and I guess I'll just call out this, the pamphlet that I'm kind of going through here is listed here on our website. I really like the Center for Food Security and Public Health. That's at Iowa State. Lots of disease-specific information, but also some general guidance on biosecurity. You can find all kinds of good information there. So, and then the Merck Veterinarian Manual is a good one to check, on specific disease issues. They now have an app, of course, like everybody else, but you can check that out. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about animal disease traceability. When animals are moving in interstate, across state lines, they've got to be officially identified and have a certificate of veterinary inspection, okay? The official identification, a couple of requirements there. They've got to have this U.S. shield and an official number. That can be the National Uniform Ear Tagging System, such as we find on these USDA silver tags, or it can be a 15-digit animal identification number starting with the country code of 840. Couple of examples here of what official identification is in each species, and I'll let you look at those later. A couple important things here. We don't want you to remove official IDs. You see this picture of this cow here. She's been tagged a whole bunch of times. We advise our veterinarians not to double tag those. In fact, it's really illegal to do so at this point, to put more than one official ID in there. So because it interferes with the traceability of this animal. So and really that's a slide for veterinarians, but I thought it might be good to talk about here. Here's a health certificate if you've never seen one before. 46 is our state code. There's all kinds of information there. There's a continuation sheet. We do have electronic CVIs available now, which we're strongly encouraging folks to use if they're so inclined. A slide here that we share with veterinarians on how to make sure youth exhibitors or anybody really going to a fair or an exhibit will succeed, and that's making sure that all of those signs of contagious infectious disease are not found on the animal, that official identification is recorded, any required testing information is on there. Just make sure that we've done a good job there. So I'm going to skip over poultry exhibition because we're getting close to the end here, but there's some information there if you're specifically interested in poultry. A couple other things here really briefly. The VCPR, the veterinary client-patient relationship. I think this is an important thing to teach youth, is that it's important to develop a relationship with a veterinarian so that if something comes up, you know who to call. They're familiar with you. You can talk about you can talk about the concerns that you're having without having to start from scratch. So a vaccine program. There really isn't a cookie cutter one. They really need to be looked at with the individual in mind, and that's why that VCPR comes into play. Importance of a quarantine period for animals coming onto an exhibitor's property, or when you come home from the exhibit. We generally recommend 3 weeks isolation from other stock at home. There's a link here if you want to look at some information on foreign, emerging, and zoonotic diseases, and a link to our reportable disease list in South Dakota. And then, of course, our website. So I think I'm over time, but that's a quick breeze through some of that information, and be glad to take any questions.
Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Oedekoven, for walking through. I know it's a lot of information, and it's sometimes hard to cover a little bit on each of our livestock species, especially when we are talking about youth projects and things. So thank you for taking a great stab at it. Go ahead and type your questions into the chat box. As you're doing that, just going to kind of start with the question of, you mentioned the importance of vaccination programs, and you really highlighted a couple of key ones for each species. Why is it so important to maintain a vaccination program with our youth projects that's maybe different than a commercial vaccination program?
Okay, I forgot if can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, I think, a couple things. One, vaccines are, even for many adults, somewhat of a mystery of how they work and, what are we doing with a vaccine and how are vaccines different from antibiotics, antibiotics being used as a treatment versus vaccines as a prevention. And I would, if you get a chance in these youth projects to have a workshop or presentation by a local veterinarian on the importance of preventing diseases and vaccines being part of that prevention, I would highly recommend that. I think it's a good opportunity to explain those differences because, as I mentioned, even for adults, it's difficult sometimes to understand what they do and why and when to choose a certain vaccine over another. So for one, I think it's a good time to go over that. But secondly, thinking about vaccines for diseases that are zoonotic diseases like rabies, I think it's very important that those animals be protected to prevent disease in those animals so that we can also prevent spread of those diseases to the youth. So, and I'm sure there's a few other reasons too, but those are two that come to mind. So.
Well, as you're thinking of your questions, we are trying something new this year and are going to utilize the poll function of Zoom. So you'll see on your screen a quick couple of questions. So go ahead and click your responses to those questions as you're thinking of other questions for Dr. Oedekoven. This is just a good way for our committee to kind of see what's the benefit of our webinars. In addition, kind of what are you looking for potentially in future webinars as well to make sure that we really are tailoring them to your needs. So go ahead and take a couple minutes there just to click the answers to each one of those 5 questions. I see one other question for Dr. Oedekoven has come in, and that question is, how long should we keep health papers in our county offices from our fairs or achievement days?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so health certificates are by federal law required to be kept for most species for 2 years, or excuse me, for most species for 5 years. For poultry and swine, it's only 2 years. So the veterinarian is keeping a copy of those. Our office keeps a copy of those. I guess the only reason why you would keep those at your county office would be in the event that we have some disease traceability issue. That's I guess from my point of view why you might want to keep those, in which case if you keep them a couple months, that's probably all you need. Now there might be other reasons why you would want to keep copies of that information as far as exhibitors or animals that are there at the show. But I guess from my perspective for animal health concerns, I wouldn't see the need to keep them longer than a couple of months, if at all. Again, we've got copies of those, and the issuing veterinarian does as well.
I still see a few people completing the poll, and you can continue to type in your questions in the chat box. One other question to consider, what might be some tips for those 4-H or volunteers helping at a weigh day to really help maximize our biosecurity practices?
And are you talking specifically about hogs? Is that right, or about swine projects?
You start with swine and then maybe touch on any of the other species that might have other major concerns too. Because even the counties might have weigh days for some of their cattle exhibits or their other project animals.
Sure. Well, I think um, in general, sanitation is key. You want to be sure that your facilities and your scales are reasonably clean. Obviously we're talking about livestock, so it's not going to be sterile by any means, but reasonable attention to sanitation, remove manure and things like that from the scales before you get started, or preferably when you get done, get it all cleaned up so it's clean for the next time too. But thinking about what our staff with Animal Industry Board spends a lot of time at the state fair, looking ahead of time at the cleaning of the facilities by the state fair staff and others who are involved in that, and making recommendations for getting things cleaned up there. So, sanitation just about can't be overemphasized. So that's an important part of it. But I think the other part is knowing when animals come to those weigh days, that they are healthy. That I think it's really important there to emphasize to the youth exhibitors, if they have sick animals or if they've had animals at the home place that are ill, it's probably a good idea not to bring their animals to the weigh day that day. And I realize that can really mess up a program, but again, keeping in mind the priority of the program versus learning about animal ag production. One of the important concepts is health and not moving animals that are ill for a number of reasons. But so then beyond that, Heidi, I think we did develop some specific guidance on weigh days for PED virus, and some counties adopted those and modified those. And I don't have them in front of me here, but that might be something we could get a hold of and send out to the group. So I don't fumble it up too bad here, but if that would be okay, we'll just do it that way.
That sounds great. If you got any last minute questions, go ahead and type them. Otherwise, our next Animal Care Wednesday webinar will be February 7th. We are talking about common poultry health issues in an era of very few poultry veterinarians. So if you've got poultry exhibitors or lots of different folks that maybe are interested in starting poultry, February's Animal Care webinar will definitely be something to get some more information on. And then we'll be looking ahead to March, and the topic for March is going to be sustainability's role in animal care and health, and where are we at? I don't see any new questions coming in. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you Dr. Oedekoven for taking time in the new year to start off our Animal Care Wednesday webinars. We look forward to seeing everybody on February 7th at 11 o'clock Central Time.